when you said, is the goal of the Marxists just to, burn it all to the ground kind of thing, the goal is control. Right. And you see that playing out in exactly what you're talking about. You're not allowed to ask those questions because we want to control the narrative. We want to control what you think and how you act. And we want to have absolute control over that. That's what technology is moving towards. And if you look at what does the evidence show you? Well, in South Africa, for example, there was an ambassador there. His name was Patrice Gaspard. And when the whole thing of land invasions first raised its ugly head with Cyril Ramaphosa, I met with farmers who all said they were talking to the government and they let them know, if you're going to take the land, if you're going to take the farms, we're not going to plant. So even though Cyril had signed the law was considering signing the law the first time around, Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, he hadn't done it yet. So who was in the media at that time in South Africa telling people and encouraging the appropriation of land, who's calling for the redress of racial injustice and so on and so on? Well, it was Patrice Gaspard. And who was he? He was the U.S. ambassador to South Africa, whose role diplomatically is not to weigh in a conversation like that. Well, what happened when Obama lost to Trump? I mean, when he left office at the end of his second term, when he stepped down, Obama, his ambassador was recalled. What happened to Patrice Gaspard? He was then put in as president of the Open Society Foundations. So his reward, and he was from Haiti, actually. He's a Haitian. So here you have a guy who is pushing for a policy in South Africa that the South African government, I'm going to steal from Ernst here, here's a statistic, by their own statistics, 90% of farms that are repatriated they fail. First they fail and then they become squatter camps. I saw this in Zimbabwe when the land was taken. And what happens is that the farms are never given, if the issue is race, how come the farms are never given to black farmers? Instead, they're given to cronies of the government and people that destroy them, people that either don't know how or cannot afford to farm them. So in South Africa, what's different here is that there are 30,000 commercial farmers who feed not just South Africa, but people all across Southern Africa. Yes. So the very people who are saying, you have to address the poverty and inequality in South Africa by taking back the farms, know that it's the vast majority of black people will starve because they're without the commercial farms. They know this. They did this in Zimbabwe. The reason Ernst said, if you go beyond Zimbabwe, it gets safer, is because this is still the legacy, decades later, of the land expropriations without compensation in Zimbabwe, is that the food supply in Zimbabwe is still a massive issue. Starvation and poverty and inflation have absolutely destroyed a country that was once called the breadbasket of Africa, that used to feed all of these other countries. And then you mentioned HIV, Tim. So it's very interesting because I sat in a market once in Zimbabwe having a robust disagreement with local traders there who said that HIV was created by the United States to get rid of black people. And at the time, I said, you guys are crazy. Oh, but let's take a little closer look at HIV, because I also stood in graveyards in South Africa on a Sunday night when they were digging the graves for the babies that would die of HIV that week. And every week they did this all across South Africa in every graveyard. And it was hundreds, just rows, right? Hundreds and hundreds of tiny little graves as far as the eye could see. And what you would also see was that there were little, instead of a gravestone, there were little pockets of plastic vials. And those were the monuments that were made by the women who lost their children to HIV and were not allowed to talk about it because the president at the time, Thabo Mbeki, said that HIV wasn't real. And when you actually look at HIV, who was responsible for HIV? We were told it was one of these zoonotic diseases that, this is going to sound familiar after COVID, that went from animals to humans. Actually, what I learned recently from several scientists is that animals cannot get HIV. The HIV that exists in humans cannot exist in animals.
Well, the argument is, cats have FIV, which is similar, different. The argument is mutations happen, and if there is so bird flu, for instance, what they say is humans can't, it's really difficult for humans to get it. It has to mutate in such a way that a human could get it.
But who does that mutation?
Gain of function research in Wuhan.
Exactly. It's engineered. It's engineered by human beings. And if you look at it, who is the guy? So remdesivir has been widely condemned for killing people, right? But it was sold during COVID as the number one medication to help people with COVID. Except remdesivir poisoned people, and they died of liver failure. So what happened with HIV? AZT was presented as the panacea. With AZT, this is how you would survive HIV. But what happened is AZT mimicked the progression of AIDS, and people were actually dying from AZT, not HIV. And who was the person who was behind AZT? Dr. Anthony Fauci.
What's interesting, too, is they said that COVID affected Asians more because of the ACE2 receptors. They were more prone to getting the lung infections.
Yes, because these diseases, when they're gaining function, what did COVID-19 mean? Anyone who's ever worked in biological warfare knew instantly that was the 19th iteration of the gain of function research, of the manipulation of the disease.
Well, the funny thing is, it was first publicly, like, widespread acknowledgement was in 2020. And everyone assumes that COVID-19 just meant 2019.
But it didn't. No.
Nobody takes it that way.
What it meant is that it was on its 19th iteration of engineering.
But why would they publicly announce that? Why would they say that?
Because it worked. Because people don't know.
Because it didn't matter anyway.
It doesn't matter. And also because they have information.
Like WD-40.
Well, they have information
40th
dominance,
formula.
right? Until the rise of independent media and until Elon Musk took over X, they had what's called an information warfare and fifth generation warfare, total information dominance. And so that's why they hardly cover their tracks a lot of the time.
I do find, one of the scariest things, because we've talked about this quite a bit since the gain of function research story had gotten so much prominence. They absolutely can, and by they I mean governments, corporations, biomedical research, can craft viruses that target people based on race.
Yes.
So you're talking about HIV and the conspiracy, the theory that it was targeting black people. Then you have COVID, which, and I'm not. This is not an insinuation or a theory. I'm literally saying this is a fact. COVID affects Asians more than other races. That's what they reported because of the ACE2 receptors in the lungs. That being a fact means you could absolutely engineer viruses that can target and cause massive damage to somebody based on their race.
Listen,
that's crazy.
We were talking about Liberia, okay? I went to Liberia during the height of the worst, deadliest Ebola epidemic in history. I think we can all agree that nobody wants to die from Ebola. Ooh. It's when the capillaries
Organs
of your blood
liquefy.
cells melt and you bleed from every orifice. It is described as one of the most horrific deaths that anyone can ever experience. I was in a frontline treatment center where people were dying every day. I was in the cemetery where they were being buried, and I was speaking to the grave diggers because they were all dying, and yet they were still doing that incredible job. And I had a scientist with me, a hemorrhagic scientist from the United States, who worked for the Department of Defense. And one of the things when I was talking to the grave diggers, they wanted to know, and in Liberia they speak with this pidgin English, right? So they say to me, they don't say, how are you? They say, how the body? So they say, where did Ebola come from? One question we have for you, where did Ebola come from? So I went to the scientist and I said, can you come talk to these guys? Because I said that it comes from the bats. And they like, what do you mean it comes from the bats? So I said, look, come talk to the scientist. So he came over and he spoke to them. And he said it's basically from people eating the bats. But interestingly, no one's ever found the Ebola virus in bats. What they found is the Marburg virus, which is, guess what? The cousin of Ebola, which is traced to a cave right up in the mountains, this massive bat cave. So the grave diggers say to the scientist, they say, okay, so how did Ebola come from the bats? And he says, well, when you eat them. And they look at him. They think about this. This one guy starts to smile. He says,
eating bats.
And he says, Mister, he says, my father ate the bats. He says, yes. He says, and my grandfather ate the bats. And my grandfather before him, he ate the bat. And he said, and they know the Ebola. In other words, we've been living here for centuries, mother. Okay? And we've been eating bats as long as we've been here. And we've never seen this. This is not a natural thing.
Well, they said that COVID came from eating bats, too.
Exactly.
Is that all they have? They're like, I don't know, just say bats, I guess.
Of course, because that's how they blame everything. That's why they blame everything.
That's so mean.
The
Poor
zoonotic
bats.
diseases always come from the bats.
And bats are associated with demons, vampires, and witches and all that.
And
they're just flying around.
Ozzy never got sick from... Ozzy Osbourne never got sick from bats.
Well, he's dead. That's not the best example.
Yeah, well, many years later. I'm just curious about the question you asked, just on South Africa. Lara, I'd love to hear your view, because you're sort of with one foot in South Africa and with one in America, and you know both very well. What is your explanation as to why the American media is so antagonistic to the topic of South Africa?
Because they are completely and utterly captured by the race narrative, the Marxist race narrative. And if it fails, they can't. So the reason when people react poorly when questioned is because their argument is baseless. I mean, anyone who knows that they're telling the truth is not going to, in fact, the definition of liberty, John Stuart Mill, was that only the truth stands up to questioning. And so what do we want with the truth? We want the truth to be seen. I mean, everybody wants the truth to be known, right? People seek the truth instinctively. And what happens is when you create a narrative that is built on lies, you don't want that to be questioned because it starts to crumble. And then you have to keep propping it up with other lies. And so, when I travel the United States, when I travel all across the world, people are profoundly united in many things. I'm not going to say everybody's the same because I've interviewed mothers who've told me that they're proud that they're bearing their child who just blew themselves up in an ideological struggle, and they want their other children to die the same way. Okay, I don't know any mother like that in South Africa or America. So I'm not going to tell you we're all the same. We're not all the same, but there is an extraordinary amount. What unites us is much more powerful to me, in my experience, than anything that divides us. And when you have to apply this many resources, whether it's time, money, information, whatever, to divide people, that tells you that the natural state is that we're united. But within our unity, if you go back to the Lebanese philosopher, Khalil Gibran, what does he say? That we stand, because we stand in love, like the pillars of the temple. All the pillars are needed to keep the temple up, but the pillars stand apart. So we've been taught the Marxist playbook, which is a fascist playbook, by the way, because they're just two sides of the same coin, is that we have to hate each other, right? And that we have to focus on all of these divisions, because they know that as when people are united, we're stronger than anything. The average taxpayer, no matter how poor you might be, when you unite the spending power of the American taxpayer, it dwarfs any of the spending power of the millionaires and the billionaires. So when you see that power of the people, you know how important it is to divide the people. What brought Nelson Mandela to power in South Africa was unity. Archbishop Desmond Tutu led people in chants in those stadiums where Peter Mokaba and Julius Malema wanted to chant, kill the farmer, kill the Boer. What did he chant? Black and white, together, we shall overcome.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Culture War podcast. We're live every Friday, 10 a.m. to noon, so subscribe and come hang out.